All right, welcome everyone to the Ask the Trainer session here. It's going to run open forum. My name is Gary White. I'm one of the trainers here at Potter. So any questions you have, you can put those right in the chat box. We'll answer them as we move along. And in the meantime, we're going to do an example of releasing programming with the Potter addressable panels. Let's start off. Just going to open up a new program just so we can see this list of panels here, just to cover what can handle releasing. So the AFC series, the 1150, those can all just do a sprinkler pre-action system. You're not going to have timers or aborts or anything like that on those panels. And then the IPA series and the ARC 100 can all do full agent releasing with your sprinkler pre-action or whatever you need to do. So you actually get your timers and your aborts and all that stuff on the ARC or the IPA panels. So let's just open up an ARC 100 for our example here. We're going to skip straight down to points, and basically the system that we'll program here will be, we'll just say it's a small server room. We've got 2 smokes and 2 heats, and we're going to cross zone those two. We're going to cross zone between the smokes and the heats to trigger our release in the room. So we'll start off with some points here. We're also going to have a horn strobe in there, and we're going to wire that, or in this scenario, you would wire that horn strobe as a 4-wire device, and that way we can get march code on first alarm, double time on pre-release, and then constant on release. So NAC 1 is going to be just the horn circuit. I'll go ahead and label all 4 of these real quick, and then we'll come back and change our function to match. So NAC 2 is going to be our strobe circuit. IO circuit number 1, we'll go ahead and put our solenoid on that one. And then IO circuit number 2, we'll put our abort switch. Now, personally, I like to put abort switches on the IO circuits, and that's just because the IO circuits are going to react faster to an input than the SLC loop would. So if you put your aborts right on the IO circuit, as soon as you press the button, the panel is going to know you did it. So you certainly can do it on a mini module on the SLC loop if you want to. That'll work fine. I just think it is a little more effective on the IO circuit. And again, that's just a personal preference there. So let's back up to the functions here. So the horn circuit we're going to leave as general purpose. Strobe, we'll go ahead and select one of our strobe sinks, even though we really just have one strobe, so it's not a huge deal, but we'll put a Gentex sink on there. The solenoid on the IO circuit, we're going to set as the release solenoid option. And then the abort we'll set as the contact input abort. All right, let's go ahead and label our SLC loop. So we're just going to keep it simple and label these as smoke 1 and smoke 2, and heat 1 and heat 2. And then 0.5 will be our pull station for our manual release. Go ahead and set our smoke detectors, set our heat detectors, and then the mini module here. And you just leave it as a pull station, and it's going to recognize when that pull station's in a releasing zone that's what it's being used for. There's a good question here that's a little off topic from the releasing subject, so I'm going to leave that in there. We'll answer that as soon as we get through this example. We'll come back and answer the, it's a sounder-based question. We'll come right back to that after the releasing example. But that is a good question, so I do want to address that. All right, we got our points in here. Now let's move over to our zone screen. And we're going to need 3 zones. So we got a zone of smokes, a zone of heats. We're going to cross zone those to our releasing zone. So first thing I'm going to do is just delete everything out of this first zone here. And this is going to be our smoke zone. So we'll call it server room smokes. You're going to leave that as an alarm style. The output pattern is the main thing we want to change here. So we got to make sure to change our output pattern to March code. So whenever one of those smoke detectors goes into alarm, we get a March code pattern on our horn strobe. Sorry. And then we're basically just going to grab our devices here. So we need the horn and the strobe. And then we just need our smoke detectors. I accidentally re-sorted those, so they're a little out of order, but that's all right. So that's it for that one. Just the horn and the strobe and the 2 smoke detectors. Go ahead and add another zone here. This will be our heat detector zone. It's going to be the exact same thing. Server room heats, alarm. Make sure to change our output pattern for the March code. And then grab our heat detectors and grab our horn and strobe. So if any one detector goes into alarm, we're going to get a March code on our horn. And that'll be kind of our first alarm. Now let's go ahead and add another zone, and this will be our actual releasing zone. This one, we need to change our style. We got to make it a releasing style zone so that we can get to our releasing options further down on the zone settings here. Silenceable latching. The output pattern here, we're going to leave as constant. So whatever the output pattern is on this releasing zone that you set here, that's going to be the output pattern when it's actually released. So once it triggers the solenoid, that'll be the pattern that you get. And we want a constant. So whenever it's actually releasing and the solenoid's tripped, we want a constant pattern on our horn strobe. Let's scroll down to the end of the list here. And these are our releasing options. So the first one is the abort type. I'm not going to get into what each one of these is. We have a new releasing video out where we show what each one of these are. ULI is the most common, so we're just going to leave that as ULI. Pre-release timer. So once we get both of our requirements for a release, which is 1 smoke, 1 heat, how long does it take after that before it actually releases? So we'll just leave it at 60 seconds. And then the pre-release pattern here, that's going to be our double time. So any one detector goes into alarm, that's our first alarm. We get March code out of the horn strobe. Once we get a second detector of a different type, so if we have a smoke that's in alarm, once we get a heat that's in alarm, then we're going to get double time out of our horn strobe. And it's going to start counting down to the release. Manual release timer, same as the pre-release, except for this one specifically for when the pull station gets activated. Manual release abort allowed. If you check that box, then the abort switch still works, even if it's a manual release pull station that's activated. And then you got your soak time here for once it actually trips. So we're good on those settings. And then basically we need to put all of the specifically releasing stuff in here. So we need the solenoid, we need the abort switch, we need the pull station. And then the last thing we need in here is our horn and strobe, so that we can get that double time and then the constant out of that horn strobe. Once you got those zones set up, it's just as simple as going to the cross zone screen, enabling the first line here, and then selecting your input zone. So we want our smoke zone cross-zoned with our heat detector zone, and the output is going to be our actual releasing zone. Now, if we had a third zone in here, if we added another one to the input side, these are all ands in here. So if you're familiar with logic functions, this screen is just an and screen. So if we added a third zone here, it would take one input from each one of those zones to activate the release. Again, if you got any questions, punch those in the chat box there. I want to pause for a second on the releasing stuff. We're gonna do another releasing example, but first I want to address the sounder base question here. So, what's the difference between powering sounder bases with the actual sounder base power function? Let me go show you that. Compared to powering those, so sounder base power is one of the options for a NAC circuit right here. What's the difference between using sounder base power or using aux constant? So the difference is that the sounder base power is what tells the panel that that circuit needs to have a pattern. So if you're familiar, if you know how to program sounder bases, I'm just going to add one in. So we got a sounder base here. And for the time being, let's just make our abort switch sounder base power. And we'll come back to our releasing example, the second releasing example here in a minute. Sounder base power. Now let's go to our zones. Let's add our apartment. Alarm zone, all this stuff's fine. And then the output pattern. So typically for a smoke detector, you'll want temporal 3 on that sounder base. And then if you're familiar with how to program sounder bases, you need to put the detector and the base in the zone. And then you also need to put the sounder base power in the zone. So we need to call it sounder base power so that it follows this temporal 3 output pattern. If we labeled this sounder base power as constant aux, first of all, that doesn't go in a zone. Aux power doesn't go in a zone, so we'll take that out. And then basically what would happen is when this went into alarm, it wouldn't matter what pattern we put up here, it would just put out a constant tone. So the reason you have to use the specific sounder base power option, and then you have to put that in the particular zone with the sounder base, is so that you get your output pattern that you're looking for. Same thing would apply. Let's say you have a bigger program and maybe you've got separate sounder base powers. You need to make sure you're putting the right one in the right zones. So if you got one power circuit for the first floor, one sounder base power circuit for the second floor, make sure you're putting the right one in each one of those zones. And the easiest way that you're going to find out that you didn't put it in the right zone is whenever you test it and you put that smoke detector into alarm. If it just puts out a constant pattern, you probably got the wrong sounder base power in that zone, or you forgot to put the sounder base power in that zone altogether. So hopefully that answers that question on the sounder base power. Yeah, if you got more questions that are off the releasing topic, go ahead and punch those in, and we can kind of get a list going. I'll do this other releasing example real fast, and we can come back and answer all those questions. The next one's going to be quick. Next example is just going to be, let's say we don't have smokes and heats in our server room. Let's say we just have 4 smoke detectors. Let's go ahead and add in another abort switch here too. This time we are going to put on a mini module because we're out of IOs. So we'll select that as contact input abort. Now in this scenario, we're not really cross-zoning a certain set of detectors with another certain set of detectors. We just want any 2 smoke detectors go into alarm. That's when we want to release. So our releasing zone, let's get rid of this heat detector zone because we're not going to need that. For this example, you only need 2 zones. Got to remove our cross zone first. All right, get rid of that. So we're going to have our server room smoke zone. And in reality, this could just be your general alarm zone too. You wouldn't have to make a specific zone just for the server room smokes. Because all we're really trying to do is just get a general alarm when one of these goes into alarm. And we just take all those smoke detectors, put them in here, call it March code, and then we get our March code when any one smoke detector goes in alarm. Then we go back to our server room releasing zone, and we just change this alarm count. So that's going to be your kind of your OR function. So if we change this to 2, now it's going to take 2 detectors to activate the release. And then you put all the same smokes right into this other zone here. So now we got all 4 smokes in here. We got our horn strobe. Everything else still works the same. So we've got our general alarm zone, or just our smoke detector zone, to put our March code on the horn. Now we've got our releasing zone that says all the same smoke detectors, but now we've made an alarm count of 2. So it's going to take 2 detectors before the pre-release happens, and then we're still going to change over to double time. We'll still go constant on alarm. Everything else will work exactly the same. It's just 2 different ways of doing it. So if you're looking for specifically 1 detector from this group and 1 detector from this group before you release, you're going to use the cross zone method. If you're looking for any 2 detectors, I don't care which ones they are, and I actually forgot to change these as smoke detectors, so let's do that. If you're just looking for any 2 detectors, you don't care which ones, you just want 2, then you go ahead and do it this way. Good question. Does the 2 count affect the manual release? Pull stations bypass an alarm count. So because we've got this labeled as a pull station, it's going to totally ignore that alarm count, and it's going to kick straight into pre-release. Oh, forgot to put the abort switch in there. So now we got our releasing zone. And that's pretty much it for the releasing example. So like I said, we have a new releasing video on the website that basically just covers exactly what I just did here. Walk test says enable or disable AVs, but it pertains to all outputs. That's true. So it's going to say enable, disable AVs, but when it says AVs, it really just means all outputs, so relays included. And let's talk about that option for a second. So whenever you go through, when you try to put your panel into walk test, you go through kind of a series of questions. One of those is enable or disable AVs. If you disable the AVs, your horn strobes and your relays, none of that's going to trip when you set off alarms. If you leave them enabled, when you set off a new alarm, everything's going to trip for about 5 seconds and then turn back off on its own. So that's going to be horn strobes, that's going to be relays. As far as the panel is concerned, when it says AVs in that instance in the walk test, it's talking about actual NACs and relays. Another question here that I missed a second ago. Can I use one abort switch to control 2 releasing zones? No, abort switches can only be in 1 releasing zone. Can you release a solenoid 2 different zones? Same thing. Solenoids and abort switches can only be in 1 zone each. So they can both be in the same zone together, but a releasing solenoid can only be in 1 zone. Same thing with an abort switch. It can only be in 1 zone. When using the low temp function on the heat detector, can you test that without superpowers? That's actually no is the answer. So you'd have to either take an ice pack up there, maybe. Unfortunately, if you don't have superpowers, it's going to be a little harder to test for you. Some people use like a circuit cooler on it to spray it, but you do have to change that temperature on it. No way to do so. If you're familiar, if you can go through the keypad and you can activate point control and just put a point into alarm. If you wanted to test out your programming on a smoke detector, or if you wanted to test the alarm function on the heat detector, you can do that through point control, but you can't do a low temp test through point control. So you have to somehow drop the temperature on that detector. Good question. Coming in here from Tony Moore, I forgot to mention he's the training supervisor. He is hanging out here in the chat box, helping answer questions and just putting out some general information here. So we are adding a recorded webinar section where we're going to have webinars that we've previously done where you can just watch those back if you missed one, or if you wanted to look at something that maybe you heard on one of the webinars but you forgot what it was. Couple questions. How to set up an abort switch with a monitor module. That would be like we did here on SLC loop 7, or SLC device number 7, I'm sorry. So we've got a mini module, and then we made the function on that mini module contact input abort. Another question, can you use cross zone to have one release zone trip another? So I'm guessing this would be if you had multiple solenoids that you needed to trip at the same time. You could do that without having to go through that process. So let's do this. Well, really, you don't even have to do it that way. We could have, let's get rid of that. Let's change this back to sorry about that, I had the screen frozen. But you could just have multiple solenoids in one releasing zone. So what I did here is I changed number 4, or IO circuit number 2, back to a release. I changed that to another release solenoid, and then I just added that right into the same releasing zone that we had the first one. Now, if you're talking about 2 different areas with separate pull stations, separate abort switches, that would be a little different. And I don't think that would, you could do it, but I don't think it'd be allowed per code necessarily, because the detectors have to be directly where that solenoid's at. Okay, 5 zones of FM200 and 1 pre-action sprinkler that serves all of the FM200. So you could use the same detectors that you're using for your 5 zones on the pre-action sprinkler solenoid. And I think that would possibly be the answer to your question there. So your detectors can still be in multiple zones. Even though I've got all these smokes right here in this releasing zone, I could still take these 4 smoke detectors and put them in another releasing zone and tie that in directly with my pre-action sprinkler. Using a discharge pressure switch and a discharge strobe outside the area, you would do that just like you would a normal zone. So we would do that separate. Oops. So we would have a separate zone for the discharge strobe. I'm going to use a NAC module because I'm out of NAC circuits. So we'll call this a general purpose. This will be our discharge strobe. Then we're also going to have another input here, mini module, and this will be our discharge pressure switch. And we could just call that contact input fire alarm. And then we would basically just take those two devices and put them in a zone together. Whoops, I grabbed the wrong two. Those two devices. So that's a good question, and that's a pretty common thing too. You'll have a separate strobe or horn strobe outside of the, maybe on the outside of the door that goes into the server room, and that's just a discharge confirmation strobe or horn strobe. And usually you're going to have an extra pressure switch that you're monitoring with that. And then once that pressure switch is activated, you know a release happened, and then you'll trigger this discharge confirmation strobe directly from that pressure switch. So in that case, it would kind of be totally different. Dip switches on the strobe. I think maybe the way I did this is a little confusing. Normally that would just be coming right off a NAC circuit. In this case, I'm using a NAC module, which means I'd have a separate NAC module there sitting with 24 volts on it, and then when I tell it to, it passes that 24 volts through to the horn strobe. Apologize for that. I probably should have used an IPA 4000, so I had a couple more outputs to work with there. In some cases, I've seen some places where they don't have that discharge confirmation pressure switch that they're monitoring. And if that was the case, you would take that same NAC circuit and just call it a solenoid and drop it right in with your releasing zone so that when the solenoid trips, the strobe trips also. I think that covers the confirmation strobe. Let's back up to the 5 zones with the FM200 and the pre-action sprinkler. Are you good on that question? Be able to use the same inputs for multiple zones? I think that would solve your scenario there. But let me know if that answers your question on that. The manual release pull stations, those can also be in multiple zones because remember the input that we used on that was just a contact input pull station. So you can still map those to multiple zones. So just to show you here, so we've got this pull station on our releasing zone. Let's also drop it up here in general alarm. So we could do it like that. The release follower input. As far as I know, let's go to it so you can see what that is here. That's one of the options for a contact input is release follower. Now, as far as I know, that's going to be the same thing as doing a pull station in a releasing zone. It's going to accomplish the same function. But to be honest, I never used that one. So maybe Tony might have some more input on what specifically you would use that for as opposed to just using pull station. That one may actually have a limitation on it. Let's see here. So that one can only be assigned to releasing zones. So I guess that would be just a different option to specifically call it a manual release instead of just calling it a pull station. But in my mind, I always just use the pull station option. All right, we've had some good questions here. Keep those rolling in. If you got, again, you can have questions about anything. It doesn't have to be releasing. We're just trying to kind of have a topic for each Ask the Trainer so we can cover something specific, but it's still open for any questions you have about anything else. So feel free to keep those going. If I answered your question, but I maybe didn't make it clear enough, or I didn't answer it for what you were asking, don't be afraid to type it again, and I can clarify a little more on certain things. Is using general aux constant on the sounder base is an issue? It is if you're looking for a pattern on the sounder base. So if you have a system that you installed, and let's go to our apartment. Let's change this back. Let's say instead of using the sounder base power for your sounder bases, you just used aux constant. They're still going to work. They're just only going to be a constant tone whenever it's an alarm. So if that's okay, then you're fine that way. But if you're actually looking to use, you know, this temporal 3 on the sounder bases for smoke, or temporal 4 for your CO detectors, let's say this is a CO with a sounder base, and I want temporal 4 whenever that sounder base is active. If you just use constant aux to power the sounder bases, this pattern's not going to happen. It's just going to be a constant tone out of the sounder bases. So if that's okay, then you're fine. If you need that temporal 4 when the CO detector is active, then you're going to want to go back and change that to the sounder base power, and then make sure that you add that to each one of those zones with the sounder bases. So to answer your question, yeah, it's fine as long as constant is fine for your output tone. You're just not going to get the pattern. That's the only thing you're going to lose is your pattern control on the separate inputs. Another question here I'm going to answer in a second. In the meantime, I just want to pull up our webinar schedule. I believe this hardware and software are both full now, but we are updating these regularly. So if you're looking to get in on a hardware, software, 4064, something like that, we are updating all these regularly. So check back there. We'll have new ones out. And let's look at our other question here. Okay, good question. So in an apartment complex or an apartment application, you've got a sounder base on each smoke detector in the apartments. And when one detector is active, it's a supervisory. When 2 or more of those supervisory smokes activate, you want an alarm on the system. So here is how you can do that. And I'm going to open up a new program here just because I need some more stuff to work with here. So we're going to go with an IPA, 4000. So the way you could do that Let's go to points. Let's add some stuff in here. Let's just say we've got 4 apartments. Let's add 4 smokes. We're going to make all 4 with a sounder base. And we'll label these. Let's label the sounder bases for each one. And let's make these all supervisory. Sounder base. Actually, let's just do a horn strobe circuit there. Let's do NAC2 as our sounder base power. And then this is the part where you have to kind of get a little creative here. Basically, what you need is a separate output. So we're going to take those supervisories and we're going to convert those to an alarm. So there's not a way to do that with an equation or anything like that. So what we need is to trigger another output or a relay and then monitor that relay for an alarm function. So there's a couple ways to do it. I like to do it right inside the panel if you have that ability. So you can use one of these I/O circuits, call it general purpose, and then tie a PAM relay to that and monitor that PAM relay with the other I/O circuit and just call that a general or contact input fire alarm. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is with an OROI, which is one relay and one input. And this will just be apartment alarm, we'll call it. So 2 smokes will trigger this relay, monitored by this relay, or I'm sorry, trigger this relay, monitored by its own input, and we're going to call that fire alarm. So some way you're going to need another output and input to do it. And let's look at how you do that in the actual zones. First off, we're going to have 4 zones for our apartments, and then we're going to have an extra zone to do that 2 detectors into alarm function. So we're going to need 5 total zones here. Let's just label all these. I'm going to do them all at once, just make it a little quicker. Zone 1 will be apartment 1. Zone 2 will be apartment 2. 3, whoops, skipped one. And zone 5, we'll call it 2 apartment alarm or something like that. Just to, obviously you can name it whatever you want, but we'll just do it this way so we can clearly see what it is. Now these apartments are all going to be supervisory. This is also going to be supervisory, and I need an extra zone actually. I didn't add enough. This will be the zone. The 2 apartment alarm will be the zone that we're using to trip the relay. Let's relabel this 2 apartment smokes, and let's call zone 6 the 2 apartment alarm. So those are all going to be supervisory, and this one's going to have a count of 2. I'm not going to worry about these other settings for this because you can do, we can do our patterns here. Temporal 3 on the rooms. I'm not going to get into all that part right now because the most important part is just getting the 2 supervisories to turn into 1 alarm. So let's do this. Apartment 1, put in our smoke and our sounder base and our sounder base power. Same thing for 2. Same thing for 3. We could also highlight all 4 of these and just put the sounder base power over at once, and it'll go into all 4 of those zones. So that way you don't have to do it each time. So now we got our apartment set up individually. Now we just want to take the smoke detector from each one. Now it's going to bring the sounder base with it automatically, but we're just going to take that back out. We only or I'm sorry, from each apartment in here. So here's our 4 smokes set up for a count of 2. And then we'll also go ahead and whichever way you're going to do it, whether you're going to do it with an OROI, we'll put that relay in there. Or if we're going to do it with IO circuit 3, going to a PAM relay that we're monitoring with IO circuit 4, we'll put IO circuit 3 in here. So now when 2 of these rooms go supervisory, activate this relay and this IO circuit. Then we'll go to our 2 apartment alarm. Now, obviously, this could also just be our general alarm zone. So let's do that. Let's say we general alarm stuff. You can just put that point right in general alarm. And then just put whatever's monitoring that relay. So whether we're doing it this way, an RI, here's our general alarm horn strobe, or we would put monitoring the other IO circuit, the PAM relay for the alarm, we put that in general alarm. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So it's basically just have apartments and then having a separate zone where you got every smoke detector in there with a count of 2, and then a separate output in there, and then you're just monitoring that output whatever way you need to with another point that you're dropping into general alarm. That's the easiest way to do it. And again, you can do it however you want. I've got both examples showing here. So I've got the example that I prefer is to do it with an IO circuit 3 and 4, just because you're kind of doing it right inside the panel. Obviously, you can do it with an OROI also. And in that case, you just need to put the relay from the OROI here and put the input in the general alarm and monitor that. So there's not a way in the software to say, hey, I want 2 smoke detectors that are supervisory. When I get 2 of them, that equals an alarm. So you have to do it physically. Excuse me, you have to do that physically and then just program it to work that way. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, let me know. I can try to explain it differently. Yeah, so there may be another way to do it, but this is kind of the cleanest way, I think, because you're really only adding 2 extra zones, well, really only 1 extra zone, and that's your supervisory with a 2 count. Your general alarm you're already going to have anyway. It's just a matter of either adding a PAM relay and tying that to an IO circuit like I did for this one, or adding an OROI and monitoring that for that purpose. But zone-wise, you're only adding 1 additional zone. And just to make sure I'm not missing something on the example there, if it was a case where you had 2 smokes in each apartment and you wanted, if both of those smokes in the same apartment went into alarm together, that was an alarm on the system. But not 1 smoke in one apartment and 1 smoke in a different one, then you're gonna have to do it a little more specific. So if it's a case of any 2 smokes on the floor or whatever causes an alarm on the system instead of supervisory, you can do it like this. If it was a scenario where the only thing that causes an alarm is both smoke detectors in the same apartment in alarm together, then you're going to have to do multiple zones for that. So you'll have your apartment, you basically have 2 zones per apartment. So you'd have 1. Let's just do a quick example. Let's go to points. Let's add a second smoke detector. We'll call it apartment 1 bedroom. Let's add a sounder base for that. Supervisory. Back to our zones. We've got our apartment 1. Now let's go ahead and throw in the other smoke detector and sounder base, which would be the apartment 1 bedroom. And then basically you'd have another zone for each apartment where you would be triggering that relay that we did there. So this would be apartment 1, 2 smokes, or whatever you want to call it. Apartment 1 alarm, maybe, because we're doing supervisory for everything else. Still going to be a supervisory zone, still going to do a count of 2. And then we're just going to put both of the smokes from that same apartment together. And then our output that we want to trigger for alarm. So same thing, but in this scenario, it's just going to use up a lot more zones. So if you're looking for 1 smoke per apartment, or maybe 2 smokes per apartment, but any 2 smoke detectors anywhere triggers an alarm on the building, you can do the first method, which is just taking all the smoke detectors from the apartments in a zone together, triggering the output that you're going to monitor for alarm. If you're going to be doing, I have 2 smokes in each apartment, and I only want to trigger a full building alarm if 2 smokes in the same apartment activate at the same time. Then you're going to have an extra zone per apartment. So I'll have my apartment 1 alarm where I've got a count of 2, and I've got both of those detectors in there in the output. And you'd have a separate one for each one. So I'd have apartment 1 for the supervisory, and then I'd have apartment 1 alarm. Apartment 2 supervisory with both detectors, apartment 2 alarm with both detectors. So in that case, you would be doubling your zones essentially. Sounds like that was the scenario for the related to that question. So yeah, unfortunately there's not really a cleaner way to do that. You're gonna double your zones if that's the scenario where it's 2 smokes in the same apartment. That's what gives me my alarm instead of any 2 smokes in the building gives me my alarm. And hopefully both of those examples make sense to everybody, even if you didn't ask that question. If that doesn't make sense, let me know. Tony put in the chat box there the email for tech support and for training. So certainly if you have a specific job and you're trying to figure out how to set up your program for that specific job, maybe you don't want to go over that on the Ask the Trainer, feel free to email those questions over. We can answer them separately, or call tech support or email them, or however you want to do it. A lot of good questions. Keep them coming if you got more. We can stay on here as long as we need to if we've got good questions coming in. All right, nothing new coming in. I just want to thank everybody for joining the webinar here. I'm not going to close it out just yet, but I'll keep it up for another 5 minutes in case something else comes in. If you think of something afterwards or something like that, feel free to email us at training@pottersignal.com. And keep an eye on the webinar section of our website. We'll keep going for updating our webinar schedule on there. What is a reverse polarity circuit? So that's going to be, let's go to this one. That one, oh, I thought that was one of those options, but maybe not. I mean, every releasing circuit's kind of reverse polarity. You're going to add a end of line resistor diode on the solenoid circuit. And then there used to be something called a reverse polarity, kind of like a city tie circuit also, that was used to tie to a municipal box right to central station. But those aren't really used anymore for the most part. I guess I'll clarify that a little more. So solenoid circuits are reverse polarity just like NAC circuits are, but NAC appliances, horn strobes, have diodes built into them, whereas solenoids do not. So that's why we have to add an end-of-line resistor diode assembly on a solenoid, whereas on a NAC circuit, you just hook it up and it's already got a diode built in.